Washington, D.C., the capital of our country. It is a beautiful city with many monuments to our country's most famous citizens and its many heroes and heroines. But one monument stands above all the rest. In fact, no building in Washington, D.C. can be as tall. For this monument was built to help us remember the father of our country, the man who led America to freedom and who became our nation's first president, George Washington. George Washington lived long ago, in colonial times. In those days, British soldiers marched down village streets throughout the land, for America was ruled by a king in England, a country across the Atlantic Ocean. Young George lived on a farm in what would someday be the state of Virginia. Back then, farm children usually didn't go to school, so George's mother taught him and his little sister and brothers how to read, write, and do arithmetic. George especially liked arithmetic, and he enjoyed measuring things. His favorite person was his big half-brother, Lawrence. Lawrence was a captain in the English Navy. George admired him and thought that he, too, would like to be a military officer when he grew up. Lawrence was married to Anne Fairfax. Her father, Colonel William Fairfax, was well known throughout Virginia. He was wealthy and respected, and he liked George, who by the time he was in his teens had learned how to measure or survey land. Many people, including Anne's father, were impressed by George's ability to pay close attention to details. George made sure that everything was perfect, and so Colonel Fairfax asked George to be a surveyor to measure land where practically nobody lived, land full of trees, dangerous rivers, and wild animals. Despite the dangers, George did an excellent job. In fact, he was so good at surveying that he was hired to do many other land surveys, even though he was still only a teenager. Some years later, Lawrence came down with tuberculosis, a disease that can be cured today, but couldn't be cured then. So he died. As you can imagine, George was very sad. In his sadness, George decided that he would take his brother's place as a military officer. He read many books written about military science. If he was going to be a soldier, he wanted to be a good one. George's studies would be rewarded. In time, he became an officer in the Virginia militia, which was like a small army. Not long after that, the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, sent George and several others to deliver a message to the commander of Fort Le Boeuf, a French military garrison more than 400 miles northwest of Virginia. In his message, the governor told the French that they had to leave the fort. You see, at that time, the English king and the French king both wanted to take over large sections of North America. It was snowy as George and his men traveled to the fort, and as they ventured onward, it turned bitterly cold. When Washington's group reached the fort and delivered Governor Dinwiddie's message, the French commander said he wouldn't leave. In fact, he continued, his orders were to build French settlements and take more territory. Through the cold and snow, Washington and his small group returned to Virginia. After he arrived, he told Governor Dinwiddie that the British should build a fort to block the French. It was built, and George was appointed as its commander. As they made their way to the new fort, George and his men fought a group of French soldiers. George was victorious in this battle, the first in what became known as the French and Indian War. He and his men fought several other battles in that war, some of which they lost. During those conflicts, however, he gained valuable experience as a soldier. After the war, George married Martha Dandridge, a young widow with 2 children. For the next 15 years, he, Martha, and their children lived happily at Mount Vernon, which he had inherited after Lawrence died. George was now an important landowner, and so was elected to the House of Burgesses, where many of Virginia's laws were made. But taking care of Mount Vernon took most of his time. He kept busy making certain that his garden and fields were properly tended. In fact, George wrote to many experts in England to find out the best ways to manage his farm. He also read many scientific books on farming, and he kept excellent business records. When he wasn't working, George, Martha, and their children traveled to nearby towns, where they visited friends in their homes, shopped, and attended plays. But most of their time was spent at Mount Vernon. Inside the stately mansion, the Washingtons and their many house guests would play cards and chess, would have dinners, and with music playing brightly, would dance late into the night. George and his family were very happy during this period. Not everyone in the 1770s was as happy as the Washington family. People were becoming upset at the King of England, who, as time went on, taxed Americans more and more heavily. They also were upset because the king told them that they had to keep English soldiers in their houses. The Americans thought the rules and taxes were unfair. Then Lord Bottetourt, a British official, said the House of Burgesses could no longer make laws. Angry Americans said that they were now being taxed without having any say about how they were being governed. Then the colonists began to take matters into their own hands. In Boston, a large number of them, some dressed as Indians, boarded a ship that had brought tea to America and dumped the tea overboard, saying it was unfairly taxed. Despite this so-called Boston Tea Party and other actions, the King of England didn't take the Americans' complaints seriously. So the First Continental Congress, made up of many important colonists, met to discuss what to do. George Washington, who of course attended, wanted to stop all trade, all buying and selling between American and English companies. Another meeting, the Second Continental Congress, met the following year. During that meeting, George said he didn't want war with England, but he thought it couldn't be avoided. Meanwhile, people throughout the colonies discussed who could lead American soldiers against England, which at that time had the best army in the world. George Washington was selected. As a surveyor, he knew the lands where battles might be fought, and that would certainly help America's soldiers. As an officer who had studied military science, he could make clever battle plans. As a military leader who had experience in the French and Indian War, he knew how to lead troops. And as a landowner and businessman, he knew how to manage a large organization, all important skills needed by a military leader. But it would not be easy. For one thing, American soldiers were not really soldiers. They were farmers and shopkeepers and tradesmen. And they served for only a 3-month period, barely enough time to be trained properly, much less fight skillfully. And there weren't very many of them either. America had far fewer soldiers than England. Food was often in short supply too. Sometimes American soldiers did have enough to eat, but often their pots were empty. The Americans went through many hardships during the war, perhaps most